But I teach at the University of South Dakota in their physical therapy department. I'm actually working on another doctorate, which is just poor decision making, but I'll finish my PhD here in a little bit in health sciences. But I went to school at USD. I did my PT training at Duke University and then came back to the Midwest because I like it here so much. All my alphabet soup here, just to explain maybe what my areas of expertise are I'm a certified exercise expert for aging adults. So my biggest area of interest are those individuals over the age of 50. So hopefully you guys feel appreciated, and I'm quickly getting close to being my own subject. But I really enjoy studying all aspects of aging. I do a lot of work with the National Senior Games Association. I have a research agreement with them, and so I follow them wherever they go and do competition. I study those athletes. So we look at what's possible and then sort of fill in the gaps about what we haven't known about that population. I'm not an expert, a certified expert in pelvic floor health, but I work a lot with patients who have incontinence or pelvic floor issues, and I see it so much, and I think it's an undertreated area of healthcare. I see so many patients who come in and they have back pain or shoulder pain or hip pain or something else, and I'll, just as a screening question, say, do you have any bowel or bladder issues? And so many people will say, well, yes, but I had 2 kids, or yes, but I'm 66, or there's always an excuse, or yes, but my doctor just told me I'm gonna have to live with that because of my age, or fill in the blank health diagnosis. And I think that's actually pretty short-sighted in our treatment of optimal well-being. There are a lot of things we can do. So I'm certainly wearing the hat of a physical therapist, which means I'm not, my first line of approach is not pharmacological interventions. I'm not big on, I can't prescribe medications, and I don't. There are certain situations where maybe that is needed, but I think there's a lot we can do with behavior changes and physical activity to make this problem better. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. I quick just wrote this down so I don't forget what I'm supposed to talk about. I am my mother's daughter, so I might just start going off on a tangent. Bring me back. But it is, and I just threw a stat in here if you read the intro to the talk, but according to the CDC, more than half of adults over the age of 65 experience some degree of urinary or bowel incontinence, and I think in my spare time when I retire, I want to write the manual for the human body, right? The one that we never got when we got these bodies, to say, like, oh, what's normal for peeing, and how is this the best way to deal with constipation, and all those things that we don't learn about unless somebody has really enlightened us to that. And I think in our modern day, a lot of times we turn to medications when we don't need to. So we're going to talk about incontinence, maybe a little bit about constipation, not a ton today, but I'll go over some behavior change, exercise, and nutrition tips that might help. And then I'm going to try to not talk for more than about 20 minutes here. And then we brought fun toys so we can try some of the exercises that I am going to talk about. And I want to be able to answer questions. So if we get a chance to do that, so if I get too carried away, just tell me it's time for lab. That's what we call it. But that's cool. So I want to first talk about what's normal, because I think that helps us understand when things aren't normal and maybe set the bar accurately for what we're doing. So when we talk about normal urination, if you have a full bladder and sit down to pee, it should really take 10 to 20 seconds to empty your bladder. You should be able to relax when you empty your bladder. You should be able to do a 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, that's my mom, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4. And that will, or a little song that helps you remember 10 to 20 seconds. That amount of time is a normal urination. And if you're not getting that amount, it could be that you're dehydrated, it could be that you're going, behaviorally, you're going too frequently, you're taking yourself to the bathroom before you actually need to. Also, another gauge is that should happen about every 3 to 4 hours. So I know when I'm at work and I haven't gone, that I'm probably not consuming enough water when it's taking me that long to feel like, longer than that, to feel like I need to go to the bathroom. Or maybe I'm really stressed out. That could be another reason. When we pee or when we have a bowel movement, either way, we shouldn't be straining. You should never feel like, and I did this the other day and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm here for a talk on urination and I'm doing it. But I think I was rushing and I was pushing in my pee out, right? So I could just hurry up and get the pee out so I could go and do the next thing that I needed to do. But that's your bladder's time. That's actually the only time, we'll talk about this in a minute, but that's the only time your bladder should be contracting. Your bladder should be contracting. Everything else should be relaxed, right? So that's something we're going to talk about with behavior change, is how to relax to pee. But we shouldn't be straining, and you really shouldn't be straining for a bowel movement. And I could do a whole nother talk on bowel movements, I think, and I'll probably get into territory that I'm not as good at. But if our diet is right and we're hydrated and we're really mindful of some of the behavior changes that can help with urination, we actually should be able to help with the bowel side of things, and that when you sit down to have a bowel movement, you don't take more than about 5 minutes and you're not straining, or maybe it's just not the right time, right? One of my favorite things I learned in PT school, one was how to massage your belly to have a bowel movement, and the other was that you kind of have a 20-minute window when you need to have a bowel movement. If you choose to use that window, you'll have an easier time than if you say, I gotta do 5 things first, which I'm sure we're all guilty of at some point, and then you go an hour later, well, that sensation passed. Well, good, convenient, right? But no, because that's going to catch up with you later. So having to strain for either of those things is problematic and can be a strain on the pelvic floor. So that's normal. Oh, so my little image here, this is just your bladder and your pelvic floor represented here. Your pelvic floor, we think of it as, it's a very private space, but it's a muscle. Your pelvic floor is really a muscle called the levator ani, and it has 3 holes poked in it if you're a woman and 2 holes poked in it if you're a man. And so men tend to have a few fewer problems with their pelvic floor, but as we age, that sort of balances out, and we all have problems with the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor is really just a muscle, and when we talk about strengthening it and taking care of it and the trauma that it goes through when we have kids or when we're constipated, those sorts of things, we're really just talking about a muscle. And if we were talking about our biceps and a problem that, 50% of the population has with their biceps, we'd all be walking around talking about our biceps, right? But we're not all walking around talking about this because it's a very private area, and that makes it more complicated. So normal, the full bladder there, when it's full, it gets a stretch reflex that says, I need to empty, right? So I always play this trick question on my students, and I say, raise your hand if your bladder is contracting right now, and the ones that haven't been paying attention are like, because they think that that's how you would hold things in. When your bladder is contracting, you're peeing. So it's a funny trick. If you ever want to play that on your friend. But when your bladder is contracting, that's when it's empty. And that's when your pelvic floor has to have its break. That's when it has to be resting and really relaxed. And that can be one of the problems that we get when we run into incontinence. So there's so many good jokes for incontinence, so I'm going to include as many as I can. But I'm going to buzz through. I pulled some of this from what I teach my students, but I think it's helpful. Knowledge is power, right, and understanding some of this and demystifying it. So I'm just going to buzz through some of the typical or most common types of incontinence. If you're having any issues or you know people that are having issues, this can be a little bit helpful. So we'll talk about stress is probably the most common, urge is in second place, and mixed is the combination of those two. And then we'll talk about functional and overflow just briefly. So stress is the one everyone says. My kids got a trampoline right before the pandemic, thank goodness, right? But lots of my friends that come over, I'm like, let's go jump on the trampoline. And you know, most of them will say, I'm going to pee myself if I go jump on the trampoline. And we have proved that that was true for some of my friends. Jumping is one. Some people call it giggle incontinence because little kids are incontinent sometimes, and they'll have that sort of stress incontinence. Any sort of pressure on the intra-abdominal space. So anything that, you know, coughing or sneezing, those sorts of things that push on the pelvic floor are stress incontinence. And it just means that that pelvic floor isn't ready for the amount of force you just put on it. So we talk about lifting weights, right, and having strong muscles to overcome a resistance. And the resistance that you're putting on your pelvic floor is that sort of stress of sneeze, cough, giggle, laugh, jump on the trampoline. We see it, I watch these Olympic athletes, and we know there are a lot of female, particularly Olympic athletes, where that their pelvic floors have had a lot of stress on them, a lot of pounding on them from their exertion, and they show signs of stress incontinence as well. So we treat younger female athletes for this problem as well, which is unfortunate. Urge incontinence, this one is a lot more to do with your autonomic nervous system. So if you know your autonomic nervous system is that which helps you feel relaxed, right? Or go into fight or flight and be panicked, right? And fight off a bear, or, you know, lift up a car that's on your child. But a lot of times our autonomic nervous system is in overdrive, particularly our sympathetic nervous system, that part of it that keeps us real keyed up, right? We have a lot of stimulus in our day, and when that's a little bit out of whack, it's much more common for us then to have urge incontinence. And so that's when you're like, I can see the sign that I'm gonna get to go to the bathroom, but the urge is so great, that bladder wants to contract, that I'm gonna leak. And usually then it's not just a little leak. Stress incontinence tends to be a smaller amount, like a little portion of what's in your bladder. And urge is more likely the bladder's just like, I'm going now, right? And then you lose it all. So you might be standing at the door with your key in the door, we talk about that, or it might be that you have warm water on your hands, and that's suddenly kicked in your parasympathetic nervous system where you were real stressed right before that, and it is suddenly taking over and saying, I'm gonna contract this bladder. So that's another type. And I think a little bit less common, but what's actually more common is to have a mix of both. We live in a kind of haired out society, I think, and we see little kids for urge incontinence as well as older adults. So figuring out how to relax and train the bladder so that when it sees the key in the door or feels the warm water on your hands, it doesn't misbehave for us. That's our goal. And some people will have a little bit of both. These we probably won't see as much here, but functional incontinence is just, and maybe we've experienced it, honestly, certainly my kids have experienced this, where like you can't get the buttons on your pants fast enough, or your feet just don't go fast enough to the toilet, and something in your ability to function with your body isn't letting you physically get to the toilet on time. And so that's one type. And then finally, overflow. So you may have heard of people who like maybe had a kidney stone, but they were still kind of dribbling, and that seemed like leaking, but their bladder hadn't really emptied. And that's actually just a protective mechanism where the bladder is going to leak a little bit so that it doesn't rupture, right? And then woven into this type are those people whose reflex, their bladder reflex, is a little bit weak. That can happen as well. So their bladder itself, when it's needing to contract to empty, it's maybe not contracting well enough, and so they might have this little leak of overflow because when they're relaxed, they're not maintaining a full bladder, and when they're trying to contract, it's leaking a little bit. So use our plumbing analogy there. But this is much more of a concern medically if you've got something blocking your urethra. I don't deal with that. I send you back to the doctor. Okay, so what can help? And certainly I will say I'm going to give you some ideas and some simple recommendations. I'm a big fan of physical therapy, so I think if you went to your physician or your primary provider and said, I think I'd like to work on this more seriously, they can send you to physical therapy for incontinence. It's not something they will think of necessarily. It might not be something they're prioritizing, but I would say if you have a good relationship with your physician and you're asking for that, it shouldn't be an issue at all. And there's physical therapists that specialize just in women's health or pelvic health issues. So in Mankato, you've got a lot of resources here. So I will say that, and sort of my disclaimer is this is really the basics, and the basics a lot of times will help a lot of people, but if yours is more complex than that, which is very, very possible as well, I would seek out a physical therapist before I would go on drugs or have surgery, certainly, because those things are harder to undo. Okay, so exercise. We're all here at the Vine, and I got to see some of your facilities. I've gotten to play in the pool just a little bit with my mom, and I will say just being active, being on your feet, walking, keeping yourself strong is an excellent way to help your pelvic floor stay strong, right? So if you're lifting weights or doing any kind of resistance training, or even the act of walking, the muscles we use when we walk link to our pelvic floor and actually help to keep our pelvic floor stronger. So you might notice somebody who becomes wheelchair bound for reasons of like lower extremity weakness or disability, their pelvic floor will start to become weak as well, just like their legs would, and it becomes much more difficult for them to stay continent. So even having that person walk periodically makes a big difference in maintaining continence. So just staying active, doing any kind of general strength training that you would do, it's a muscle. It's a muscle just like every other part of our body. And I'll show you specific targeted strength training activities, but I want you to appreciate that just generally staying active will help as well. So we're going to talk about Kegels a little bit, and I think about Kegels like these faces, right? Like, I got it. I have it. I got it. So if you don't know what a Kegel is, or you don't know about pelvic floor muscle training, that's tightening that levator ani. It's how you find and feel the levator ani, how you find and feel that muscle. And I didn't include a picture of the levator ani because it creeps some people out, but it's really just looking at you, from below. And some things to know about it, and I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to explain it, and I'm going to explain something to do if you never want to have to think about a Kegel again, because they can be confusing and sometimes frustrating. Big things with Kegels. When you're trying to tighten your pelvic floor, you want to tighten as if you're going to stop the flow of urine, like as if you were actively peeing and you wanted to stop. You can tighten as if you're going to stop from passing gas. That helps a lot of people. Same muscle. You want to, so either of those works. You want to keep breathing though. So a lot of people, because they're not really in tune with this muscle, and it seems that I've met 30-year-olds who, there's no connection, right? There's no connection between their physical control of their muscles and their pelvic floor. It seems to get worse as we age, but I will say I have met really young patients who go, I can't find it. And PTs, we do biofeedback, and we can do internal exams and all kinds of things to help find and feel those muscles. There's lots of different strategies, but you can, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to unsay it, and I know this is being recorded, but you can sit on the toilet and say, I'm peeing, I'm going to stop. If you've never found that muscle, right, that is a way to find it. But you should not practice that. We're going to get into the behavior part of things. If you want to confuse your poor bladder, you do that, and you can really scramble the messages going to your bladder if you do that. But if you're looking to find it, that is one strategy. But keeping breathing, not bearing down, probably the biggest problem we have with patients is that they kind of push because they're straining and they're looking to find it. And they might feel something because they're pushing, but then that all sort of goes awry. So this gets into fine print, but I'm going to walk through just if I was going to have someone do Kegels or pelvic floor muscle training as their exercise, this is what I would give them. So the first is actually doing quick flicks, and I think these are hard for me. But this is actually tightening and relaxing, and tightening and relaxing. And why would you do that, except that what sorts of things have we already talked about that make you maybe have to respond quickly? Anybody?
Running water.
Running water would make you respond quickly, but like, yes, you're right in that. I was thinking like sneeze, that quick change. You're right on the running water though, because we teach like how to start engaging that when you see the running water, like, okay, kick it in. But the quick ones are actually more for the sneeze and the cough and the sudden, if you could coordinate it with your bounce on the trampoline, that you would be way better than me. Quick flick. So trying to get like 20 of these in, and I've had some patients like, yep, I can do that, and I think good because I can't. But doing quick flicks, and then doing a longer hold. So tightening and holding like for 5 seconds. But for both of these, you have to keep breathing, and that's a hard part. So if you're not breathing, the risk is higher that you're maybe bearing down or straining as you're doing that activity. And I really think the easiest way to think about it is just tightening like you don't want to pass gas. If you're doing that, you're probably contracting your pelvic floor. If, however, you notice that your butt is clenched or your muscles around your pelvis have like all gotten tight, you're maybe not getting your pelvic floor just isolated. And so we want to find, a lot of times just kind of poke on somebody's butt or their hip and say, okay, do a Kegel. And if they feel like they're getting it, and the biofeedback says they're getting it, and I can still poke on their hip and not get a tight muscle, then we know that they're isolating that pelvic floor, and that's what we want them to learn. It doesn't mean that other muscles can't tighten when we're doing pelvic floor muscle exercises, but we want to make sure you find one and get it right. Okay, so don't practice that on the toilet, but if you need to explore a little bit, that is one way to find it in the first place. And some people will say, this is not weird, some people will say, I can slow it down. I can slow down my pee if I'm trying to do a Kegel on the toilet, but I can't stop it. And that, I feel like, that's perfect, right? That just means it's weak. But you found it. You found that muscle. Don't practice there, but we call it a functional faucet test. So that, if once a month you went back and said, okay, I'm just going to test it and see if I can turn my faucet off versus just turning my faucet down. And we know you're not supposed to turn your faucet off, right? But if I can just turn off the faucet, then you've got a Kegel down. Versus maybe if you're weak, you might find that you can just turn it down a little bit, and that's pretty common. The next set of exercises that I want to talk about are those that don't require you to really find that pelvic floor. They might down the road make it easier for you to find your pelvic floor, but I actually did a study on this, and I know that for years my mom has been handing out the pictures from this study. To people that she meets, because it was kind of a fun study. I learned about this approach from a clinician who was teaching it as a continuing ed course, and she was really going on and on about how great it was, how much better it was than Kegels. And I said, okay, where's your studies? And she didn't have any studies. She just worked so much in the clinic, and she was having great results in the clinic, and she was making a lot of money, and she wasn't worried about the research. And I said, well, I can't teach it in my classes unless there's research. So I was a new academician, and I thought that I could do this. So for 2 years, I had a sign on my door at USD that said, leaking urine, call me. And I signed people up for this study, and we did 2 groups. We put one group on Kegels, and we taught them what I just showed you. And then we put the other group on this ball and band exercise, which we brought balls and bands for almost everybody, I think, so we'll get a chance to practice these. If you'd like. The only folks that I would say, just to be a little bit cautious, if you've had a hip replacement and you're not supposed to rotate your hips, if that's a precaution, that's the only precaution that we really even implemented in our study either. But we found that if we put a band around, there's a TheraBand around the knees, and did a rotation out with the hips and held it for 5 seconds and did multiple reps of that, and then went to rolling in on a ball and turning the toes in, rolling in, that this group did just as well, maybe a touch better than the Kegel group did. So it's not necessarily that it's leaps and bounds better, but there are many different reasons why this is an easier way to tackle the pelvic floor. When I have patients that don't really want to talk to me about their pelvic floor, they're not finding that connection, they're not comfortable with anybody sort of messing with that part of them, that works well. And it strengthens around your hip muscles as well. So what we found, and we actually used internal biofeedback to back this up, and you can see the same sort of contraction of the pelvic floor, whether someone's squeezing, pushing the band out, or doing a Kegel. You can get the same response from the pelvic floor because of the way the muscles are attached in the pelvis, and what's attaching to that levator ani muscle. So we'll go over these, and I have them written out as exercises if you want to take those with you. So we're going to come back to those, and we're going to do a lab, a little exercise time to do that. But first, we're going to talk about relaxing. And I think I've alluded to this quite a bit already. But you need to allow your bladder to get full. So whether your problem is honestly it doesn't matter really what type of incontinence you've got going on, it's good to let your bladder get full. And I think if I'm going to be stereotypical, I run into a lot of older adults who are just so mindful and so conscientious that they will not let their bladder ever get full. And it creates a downward spiral for them in terms of keeping their continence the way that they want it. So you want to get to that point where you don't have to go for 3 to 4 hours, and you want to get to that point so that when you go, 10 to 20 seconds is how long it takes you to empty your bladder. And you might be thinking, no, that's not going to work for me. And I have had patients who I've had to say, okay, listen, we're going to do this. You might have to wear something, like wear a big pad or something, so that you can get through this transition, right, of actually trusting your bladder, because it might not work right away. And we've got to get your pelvic floor stronger. But if you keep emptying when it's not full, what happens is, imagine a balloon, right? If you blow a balloon up, I should have brought one, but I suppose with COVID, no one wants me to like let go of a balloon and slide over. But if you fill a balloon up full and let it go, it's going to go shooting across the room, right? If you just give it a couple puffs, right, and let go, it's sort of nothing, right? Not a whole lot. You're going to get a bigger response the more full it is, and that's sort of how that reflex of the bladder works. So you want it to have that full stretch so it can empty. If it doesn't get full, what happens is it doesn't completely empty, and you get this little bit of residual. And that residual is really irritating to the lining of the bladder, and that's where you start to get that, I think I have to go, but I just went, but it really feels like I gotta go, and like I don't want to go to bed, I want to get up again and go again. And my daughter did this when she was a little kid, and we had to sort of reset, right, and get her to trust that, listen, You gotta trust your pelvic floor. So later on, if you have to get up and go to the bathroom, you can do that. You can turn on a light and walk to the bathroom and go to the bathroom. It's not gonna be a crisis, and it's actually not considered abnormal even to get up once in the night and go to the bathroom. If you're getting up multiple times in the night to go to the bathroom, we maybe need to look at what type of fluid you're hydrating with in the night or before you go to bed. But really, it's not abnormal to get up and go once in the night, and that's acceptable because we're hoping to sleep for more than 4 hours. Just in case pees, I think are important, just as important for little kids to get over as for us. So we call them jick pees in the clinic, and we want to say no to jick pees. So like, we're all getting in the car and we're going back to South Dakota. I never tell my kids, you gotta all go to the bathroom. I say, if you want to go to the bathroom, now would be your time to go to the bathroom. But we don't force the going to the bathroom, and I would encourage you not to either, because if you've just gone, you should trust your bladder. And no, I probably won't need to go for another 3 hours. If you can get yourself into that routine. So summer vacation time is like the worst possible time to practice these things, right? But if you need to, if you need to wear something to safeguard against that, or pick the ideal time to really practice this so that you can start to fill your bladder more full and test it, right? See what happens if you don't do these chickpeas. I think you'll be pleased with what happens because your bladder knows what to do, but you've been training it to do something different. And so when you pee, relax, sit down, and make sure that you're not just straining to empty that thing, because if you're straining, you're crossing your wires, right? Your bladder knows to contract. You should feel this overwhelming sense of relaxation when you pee. So if you want a good position, put your forearms like on your thighs and exhale and breathe and relax like that. Some people find if they put their feet on a little step stool that helps their pelvic floor relax. If you've all seen the Squatty Potty commercials, those are actually really good on the pelvic floor and help you relax. If your feet don't touch the floor when you're sitting on the toilet, it's harder to relax. So definitely get a little stool so you can put your feet on that. But you want to feel that you can really relax when you're sitting on the toilet. The other thing to really pay attention to is constipation. And again, I'm not going to get too much into this, but if you're constipated, your colon can push on your bladder and give you those same sensations that you've got to go. And that can only be solved by getting rid of the constipation. And so we'll talk about some of the dietary things here for getting rid of constipation. A very general tool, and I'll give you just this one because my kids and family all use it, is just to do some big sweeping motions from right to left. So if you always use your right hand, you won't screw up. Just pushing from right to left across your belly. When we learned this in PT school, like 3 people went for the door. But just do these sweeping motions across your belly like that. And really any kind of like mechanical stimulation. The only risk if you go the other way and start pulling towards the right is you might get a little gassy. But that stimulus of like rubbing your belly and pushing it actually helps the peristalsis of your colon and say, oh, I can empty. So those are some good ways to empty. In terms of diet changes, some of the biggest things, right, are what we're putting in our body. So drinking hydrating fluids, and especially in the summer when it's this hot, and thankfully not today, but making sure that we're drinking things that aren't irritating to the bladder. So caffeine and alcohol do create irritation of the bladder. One of the things we do with our patients when they come in for incontinence in the clinic is we have them spend their first 3 or 4 days filling out a bladder diary. So they tell us when they peed, what they drank, when they had a leak, when they went to bed. And I've gotten multiple, even in the study, we got multiple bladder diaries back where somebody was just drinking Diet Coke the whole day. And you think, well, you're irritating your bladder the whole day long. And especially if you don't want to have to get up in the night. Stop with the bladder irritants by 3 or 4. so that you can sleep through the night, so that what's in your bladder isn't also telling your bladder it needs to empty it, right? I used to have a patient that would get up in the middle of the night, and her favorite thing always to drink was this tea, this caffeinated tea, and she would drink it even in the middle of the night when she'd go to the bathroom, and couldn't figure out why she was not able to go back to sleep and sleep through the night. So we switched to water and really didn't have to do much else with her incontinence. So those triggers or those irritants can be a problem. So keeping hydrated but avoiding the things that will irritate. And I think really committing to that hydration, right? Like eight ounce glasses a day is a really good gauge, I think, of how much you should be getting. You can go by kilograms and body weight and milliliters and be real exact if you want to look up what you should be drinking for your body weight. But if you're getting eight ounce glasses of water in a day, and then you're sprinkling in your caffeinated beverages in the periphery, or wine or whatever you're drinking, then you should be pretty hydrated. But you also know for yourself on, has it been 3 to 4 hours? And do I have to pee now? And if you don't, that might be a sign. If your urine is real dark colored yellow and you're not taking the medication that's going to cause that to happen, that can be another sign that you're dehydrated. Your urine should really be pale, and that's a hard thing to get and to really be that hydrated. Your body will adjust the more hydrated you get to not needing to pee as frequently as when you first start. That's sort of a change too. Then the other thing though, and this gets after constipation, is eating things that are going to help your colon stay clear. And that means eating green things that grow above ground, things that have lots of fiber in them. But if you think about fiber and you're putting a bunch of fiber in your colon and you're not adding any water to it, you're just going to get a nice big fibrous clog. So you've got to put the water in there. What our colon is really good at is extracting the water it needs, right? And so if you're moving slow through your colon and you're not very hydrated, your colon's going to say, we need all this water because we're not drinking enough. And so the two sort of go hand in hand. So if you're staying hydrated, you'll find that's one of the best ways to get your colon to empty. The individual who taught me about this said fresh pears. And I swear by fresh pears. If you can get your hands on fresh pears, you know you're traveling and everything's messed up, find fresh pears and eat those. You'll find probably some good success with avoiding constipation if you can consume those. I think about peas and lettuce and all those sorts of greens, broccoli that grow above ground. Interestingly, some of the more binding things that we eat that are healthy might be things that grow root vegetables, beets and sweet potatoes, and things that grow below ground, potatoes. Those things can be very healthy to eat, but if you're trying to clear out your colon, they might be things that slow you down a little bit. So thinking about that. Okay, so this was in Vermilion, where I live. We were at a chili feed, and I was going down to the bathroom. I said, I gotta take a picture. This is the funniest thing I ever saw. So we can do some exercises, but maybe before we start that, do you have questions that this has brought up already? Yeah.
Can you be overhydrated, drink too much water?
Yes, yeah. So people are overhydrated every year. You probably be voiding more frequently than that 3 to 4 with the long voids. You may show signs of muscle cramping or like loss of electrolytes, like as if you were running a lot. My husband tried to do the gallon a day thing, and he was so proud and was, running around the house like, drink a gallon and drink another gallon every day, and then pretty soon he got this crazy eye twitch. And it wouldn't go away, and I said, maybe you're either gonna have to take the multivitamin to keep up this, or you're bringing us a little bit too much water. And they went away right away when he stopped doing quite so much. And so so you can look at, you can easily go online, type in your weight, and see how many ounces per day you should, for your body weight, be drinking. I wanna say, if you're really going, I don't even want to say because I'm going to say it wrong. My metric versus the US system, conversion's gonna be terrible. But yeah, you can be overhydrated, so it's not, just like everything, it's not more is better. And the same would go for Kegels and for strength training. We do see some patients who come in and they're stressed and they have urge incontinence. And so they might have that key in the door problem or the warm water problem. But then when we go and evaluate them on biofeedback, their pelvic floor is just like this. It's always tight, right? And so those are individuals we really work on relaxation with.
Mm-hmm.
So that can happen as well if you have pelvic floor pain, or if you've had a lot of problems with constipation and that sort of thing. That can be a sign that your pelvic floor is actually got too much tone, and that could be that's really a time to go see a PT. Other questions? We're back here.
You talk about the key in the lock or autonomic stimulus.
Yeah.
It just seems like I can drive from work to home and I gotta go, but I can drive from work and run errands and enter doorways of stores. It's not till I get home and I realize maybe the answer is different because I'm a man, but.
Nope, it's actually no different for men. You've trained yourself to have that response to a certain extent because your sympathetic nervous system is saying, they're all those signals that you're home, right? You see your house, you've got your key to head into your house, all the familiar things. We underestimate our brain and our nervous system sometimes. But you've trained. And so when we work with people in that situation, part of the training, along with relaxation, is that you have to stop and be very deliberate before you get there. You're doing a Kegel, right? Take a break. You put the key in the door. You do another Kegel. And open the door. You do another Kegel. And maybe you do one more thing in your house before you even take yourself to the bathroom, so that your brain and your nervous system stops saying, we're home, we're going, right? And like, this is it. It's retraining your brain more than anything. And so whatever those steps are, when you go into the store, your body knows you're not home, right?
I swear I can walk it off.
Yeah.
You know, I said, no, we're not going.
Yes.
And I will walk this way and I'll walk that way, and then things are fine for probably 10 minutes, you know, but I feel like that's the only control.
Yeah, and then it's a matter of figuring out, okay, well, like, I'm gonna do those Kegels and decide when, like you decide when, because I mean, eventually you're gonna wanna go empty your bladder. But then also, like, was it full? Did I have irritants there that were making it even harder to get there? But doing Kegels when you get to that point of key in the door or hands in the warm water, and then you deciding, taking control of it, saying, nope, you don't get a contract right now, and I'm gonna hold my pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor is like the backup at that point, right? Because the bladder is trying. We've got a sphincter and we've got the ability to tighten with that pelvic floor, but there is going to be a point at which the bladder is going to win, and that's where we have to train the relaxation response to not happen when we're just getting home. Yeah.
I'm kind of an extreme case. I have tried everything. I've had surgery, that didn't help. That's a long time ago. I have had Botox 3 times, and it helps. But I always wear a pad, and I always use urine. And it is worth going back to these things, even when
We've had so much.
and I get bladder infection a lot
Yeah.
because I have no intestine.
Yeah. Have you done biofeedback with a physical therapist? I think yes, simply because if you've not tried it, I'm not going to say that if you've had, anytime you've had surgery or injections or things along those lines, or if you have a neurological condition, that could be another, that it's harder to get back to completely normal, right? Once you've started to change those things. And that's why I always say, if you can do PT first, but that's not how our healthcare system works. So I always just apologize in advance that happens. My grandmother went through the same thing, and then by the time I got to her and started trying to teach her some of this, she's like, everything you asked me to do hurts. She'd had surgeries and all kinds of different things happen. But I would say going to a women's health specialist, and if you call a PT clinic and say, I need a women's health specialist, they'll tell you if they have one or not. Or someone who specializes in that. You can very formally specialize in it, but most clinics will have someone who is that go-to, and they use biofeedback. They may be trained in doing a more thorough exam to see if there are other things that can help. Things that I haven't talked about, and reasons people may have had surgeries. A prolapse can get in the way and cause problems. And so while we can't solve a prolapse, there's strategies for how to position yourself so that you can regain some control even if you do have a prolapse, and sometimes strengthening around that prolapse to make a difference functionally. So I would recommend, here's the thing, there's really no risk if you go and do it. It's hard work sometimes to go to PT, to put in that effort and that time, but in the end, there's really no risk to doing it. So if you're willing to put in the time and the energy to doing it, it can be a high rewards, low, risk opportunity.
Botox scheduled for the 21st again. And he also has medication. Is that usually helpful?
So the
cranberry.
Yeah, the medications that are typically used for incontinence have a systemic response that sort of dry you up and make it less likely that you'll have an accident, but also have some side effects that make constipation more likely. And so depending on the pros and cons of that, there's a lot more side effects, especially as we age, of taking those medications to stop the incontinence. We love to take a pill, and the physicians that I've treated in my life, they always say, what's the pill I can take? And I was like, well, that's not what we do here. But I always say, if you would be willing to drive a half an hour and back to get the pill, you could just spend that amount of time doing the PT, and you might have fewer side effects. So it's certainly my bias, right? And there are times where you might say, I did my best, I followed all the PT directions, and the PT will tell you, this is as good as I can get you. And so a women's health specialist would say, if there's something that you maybe should add to the mix medically, they'll even make those recommendations and would have an opinion on the Botox.
So you just go to a general physical therapy.
So Medicare will cover physical therapy even without a referral for the first 30 days. But it's best to go to your provider and say, hey, I want to go to a PT. They can send over a referral to PT, and then you'll be covered right away for physical therapy. And I'm not super in tune to the PTs in town or where there are specialists. But if you start asking, you can call ahead to PT clinics and say, do you have someone here that would work with me with maybe a complicated urinary incontinence? And if they don't, they would often recommend a different clinic so that they don't have to deal with it. Yeah. In the back.
My girlfriend was taking that pill you were talking about, but she was having like serious falls, and she did share one time that she thought that was a side effect. Is she getting too dehydrated, or what?
Well, and I'm gonna blank on the category of medication that it is, but there are multiple side effects. They can make your vision blurred, they can make you constipated, they make your mouth very dry, they also make it more difficult. So they work like if you're going for a result of one thing, but you get some other stuff on top of it. So yeah, it could be. And they're harder to metabolize, or they metabolize differently as we age. So we hang on to more of that. So if we're getting too high of a dose, that can also be really problematic too. So I would, in general, discourage the medications if you can, just for the, especially if she's getting side effects. Yeah. Yeah.
What's a good way to train yourself when you're hearing water running?
Yeah. Yeah. What to do?
Yeah, I mean, can you train to get away from that?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess if I was going to do that, I would put on my protective undergarment, right? So that I would have that safety net. And there's a couple different options. We're going to learn the rolling the knees out against the band exercise. When you're doing the hands on the water, you can't go put a band around your knees. But one thing that we instruct is put your heels together, squeeze your heels together, and if you really want to get the pelvic floor to kick in, do a little knee bend. Do I look like a dancer? I never did dance, ever. But a little knee bend, and it's a lot like the exercise that we're going to do with the knees apart and the heels together. Heels together is really important, and that will help stop, right? And then it's a matter of, so it's the combination of I'm tightening my pelvic floor and I'm telling myself no, right? So you're sending your body signals, no, to not have the leak then. And then you want to calmly walk yourself to the bathroom. And you may need to, again, if you're getting that urge, when you're feeling frantic, that's when you want to stop and say, nope, I'm going to do this. My daughter had a short stint of incontinence when she was little, and I cracked up because kids do things naturally, right? And she was in high V, and she was about to pee her pants, and I look over and she's going like this. And she's got her feet, turned out to the side. She's riding a horse, and she's like, I got it. I'm not peeing. And I thought, I just want to take a class on that. You're doing great. It takes a little bit of training, but to engage those muscles and to then also program yourself to not void then. But then to take yourself calmly to the bathroom and then allow yourself to void. And that may take a lot of repetition, because think of all the repetition you've had up until that point, right, with the warm water. She had the same thing with warm water at that point too, so we were apparently stressing her out. Others? Yeah.
So that I can sleep through the night as much as I can, I tend to go to the bathroom at the last minute,
Mm-hmm.
and I just sit there for half an hour.
Oh, yeah.
That's probably not a.
That's not a great idea, because that's also confusing to the bladder,
Yeah.
right? So you don't want the bladder to be, well, certainly you wouldn't want your bladder to contract that long, right? So when you stand back up and you're back to your normal activities, it needs to relax again so that it can fill. If you're letting any tiny little bit that gets in there dribble out, then you're inevitably going to have some of that residual in there that's going to be irritating. So it'd be far better to wait till that half an hour has passed, go and empty what's there, and then go to bed. And then if you've got to get up in the night once to go, don't worry about it, go. Put a nightlight on, because a lot of people fall because they don't put a nightlight on. Nightlights, I think everything looks better by a nightlight. Doesn't your house look so much cleaner by a nightlight? Just a nightlight, and you won't fall. I think that all the time. That's all I would say, is don't use that half an hour to sit. Just go to the end of the half hour. Do your best, sit with your hands on your knees, give a nice big exhale, and then be done. We're not talking about the Kegels right now. We're talking about sort of the easy path to those. The first one is putting the band around your knees, and I promise to make sure I don't steal these from you. Putting the band around your knees, and once you kind of have it right, you could ultimately tie it there. But you can also just cross it over, grab the ends with opposite hands. So you pull that across your knees and tighten it up. Put your feet together, right? So just have your feet together. And then, again, if you're not supposed to do this because because you had your hip replaced, don't do it and get it.
Can't do that one either.
Careful. I thought of that. So toes go apart and heels go together, right? So you're actually keeping your feet on the floor as your toes go apart and your heels go together, and you're pushing out on that band. It doesn't have to feel real hard. The band is just to give you some resistance, but you can pull it a little more snug if you need to, and you can always tie it if your hands don't like holding it like that. Or you can use a bag clip and clip it as well. These don't have latex in them, but I can't speak for the balls. So your toes are going apart and your heels coming together, and you're gonna hold that for 5 seconds, and then you're gonna bring it in and rest for 5 seconds. Because and really just let yourself rest for those 5 minutes, because again, we don't wanna get that pelvic floor so cranked up that it's like always holding, right? You don't want it to be that. You wanna put that pressure on it for 5, and then rest it for 5. It's boring. This is a boring exercise, but it works. So feet are out and the knees out at the same time. You can do this in standing. And then back together. You can do it standing even without the band. And it'll give you a similar contraction in your pelvic floor. Right? Think of a hammock with 2 trees, and you're basically pulling the trees apart a little ways, and it's giving you that same effect on your pelvic floor. So windshield wiper feet in to rest, and then out for those 5 seconds to contract. If you're doing it standing up, I would just stand up and rest for those 5 seconds. Then to do the ball squeeze, also really simple. You're gonna put the ball between your knees, and you're gonna roll your knees in on the ball while you bring your toes together and your heels, let your heels come apart. So your feet are still flat on the floor. These are your toes. Your toes are gonna come together and your heels are gonna come apart. It's not a real big movement. Let's go back to that picture. There it is. It's not a real big movement, but you're giving a squeeze on that ball. Again, 5 seconds, hold, and then bring your feet back to neutral and rest for 5
So
seconds.
should you feel something beyond your thighs when you do
You're
this?
probably not gonna feel much. No, it's not like you're gonna be like, oh yeah, I feel that pelvic floor tight. No, you're not gonna feel it, but I can tell you, and that's what, when we did biofeedback to say, does it really? This lady says it's gonna work. It does, it does. It's a harder muscle. We don't feel the muscle the same way we would feel if we were pumping it. And this isn't so heavy of resistance, such heavy resistance. So rolling your toes in and squeezing that ball together, holding for 5 seconds, and then bringing it out. Those are your easy. If you were gonna do that in standing, right, you could bring your toes together and squeeze your knees. I don't love squeezing my knees together. You could do it with a ball and standing. I think if you were trying to do a quick ditch effort to not lose it at the sink, I would just put the heels together and bend the knees a little bit. Do a little plie. And that would, you could say, I'm gonna tighten here, and then I'm gonna wash my hands. Oh, I'm gonna tighten again, then I'm gonna wash my hands. And then give yourself the privilege of walking, not in a panic to go to the bathroom. Questions on those? No? Others?
In yoga, our yoga teacher used to say, if our legs are stretched out, she would say, just go in and out. She said that will strengthen your.
She is right on. Yes, she is right on. So she said in yoga, they were walking their heels in yoga. That rotation, so you're right on. So it's the rotation of the hips with some muscle contraction that we've learned that rotation of the hips is really connected to the pelvic floor. It provides good, we call it overflow. So the knees in is overflow to the pelvic floor, tightening those inner thigh muscles through that rotation provides really great neurological input to the pelvic floor. The out one is actually more mechanical, the way the pelvic floor is tied in to what's called our obturator internus. That muscle pulls on the levator ani and tightens it up. So there's two different mechanisms that are happening. Some people get more benefit from the roll in, some from the roll out. I'm not doing biofeedback on all of you, so just do them both. I would do them both. Anyway, very good routine, and you can do them standing or sitting. Yeah.
For those people that do have a hip replacement and they can't use the ball or the stretch strap,
Right.
that exercise is what you recommend. I have a
So,
friend who's
so
got-
here's what I will say. It depends on what your surgeon has said about your hip replacement. So it is not innate that like with a hip replacement, you can't do these things, right? And I'm being ultra conservative because I'm not your provider. If you don't have any hip precautions left, you can do what you want, right? But if your provider has said, I don't want you turning your toes out, or I don't want you turning your toes in, then I would say I would do the pelvic floor training.
Just stay with the pelvic floor
Stick with the
exercise.
Kegels, yeah, stick with the Kegels and walking, and that would be good.
Right.
You could even do a ball squeeze because of the way the ball works without turning your toes in, and you'll probably get a benefit. You will get a benefit, yeah. So to do the knee squeeze without the hip rotation and just squeezing, and even if you're worried about that, maybe a little bit bigger ball, you're gonna get that same kind of overflow to your pelvic floor. That would be good. And you could do, even with the band, pushing out on the band without the rotation, and you probably get some benefit to that as well. We really focus on the rotation when we treat it in the clinic, and so when we did the study, we excluded anyone that had a hip replacement just out of an abundance of caution, because we're being careful, yeah. Most of the hips I've been seeing lately, they're getting away from their hip precautions in less than a year, so I don't worry as much. Other questions?
So 20 times, 2 times a day? Is that the recommendation?
Yes, I would say, and when we did this in the study, just to show you, if you need some motivation, this is, so we did it for 6 weeks with this exact protocol in the study. The red line was my roll for control group, or roll in, roll out group. And that was their subjective improvement, was somewhere around 70%. The blue line was the pelvic floor group. They were a little bit lower in their subjective improvement. But these are the bars there are overlapping, meaning the margin of error was close enough that we really couldn't say that the two groups, that one was better than the other. Of course, I was like rooting for the ball and the band to be the best, but we can't say that statistically they were better, but it's a nice looking chart where they look a little bit better. But that was 6 weeks following this protocol, and you know, they're humans, so there were times when I'd say, well, I missed this one or that one. But if you're looking to make a change, we also gave them that bladder health information, so it's exactly what we gave. And our results, they filled out bladder diaries and they looked so much better after that 6 weeks. It really made a difference. Yeah. All right, I know I went over my time, so thank you for being patient with me.